The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times that the crease had gone soft, almost furry, like cloth instead of paper. By the time the wagon rattled into Widow's Ford, Adelina Conti had read it 11 times. Once on the dock at Genoa, when her uncle pressed it into her hands like it was something that might catch fire. Once on the ship in the dark, by a candle stub shared with a woman from Palermo who cried the whole crossing. Once in the boarding house in Boston, on a cot between two strangers whose faces she had already started to forget. And now, again, on a wagon bench in Montana Territory, with dust in her teeth and the mountains rising up ahead of her like something out of a dream she hadn't asked for. The terms were simple enough. A season of housekeeping, cooking, cleaning, running a household for a widowed rancher on the edge of a horse-breeding town called Widow's Ford. Room and board, $4 a month. One child in the house, a girl 7 years old. The work would begin before the snow came and end by mutual agreement sometime in spring. She was 22. She had crossed an ocean and half a continent to keep house for a man she had never met. The town announced itself in pieces. A water tower leaning east like it was tired of standing straight. A general store with its paint peeling in long strips. A church with a bell that had cracked sometime before anyone could remember, so that on Sunday mornings it rang with a broken note, like it was arguing with itself. She counted 6 buildings before the wagon stopped. A dozen people moved along the road. A woman was folding laundry off a line. 2 boys were racing a dog toward the livery. Nobody looked at her twice, not unkindly, just the particular indifference of a town that had seen its share of strangers arrive and knew better than to make a fuss over one more. She stepped down and set her trunk in the dirt. The man who came for her was younger than she'd pictured. The letter had read like it came from someone formal, someone who wrote to a mail-order housekeeper the way he might write to a bank. She had imagined gray hair and a stiff collar. The man crossing the road toward her was maybe 30, sun-worn, unhurried in that particular way of someone who had stopped performing ease for other people a long time ago, and simply had it now. He stopped a few feet off, looked at the trunk, looked at her. "You're the one from Genoa," not a question, but she answered anyway. Yes, he picked up her trunk without asking if she wanted help, and that, more than anything he said, told her something about how this was going to go. His name, she would learn before they'd gone 2 blocks, was Ezra Vance. He ran horses on land that backed up against the foothills, land his father had claimed and his father's father before that, though he didn't say it like a boast. He said it the way a man reports the weather. The house sat at the north edge of the road, where the road stopped pretending to be a street and became simply a track heading toward colder country. 2 stories, a porch missing 1 board, a curtain in the upstairs window pulled crooked, like somebody had yanked it aside once and never bothered to straighten it since. He carried her trunk in and set it by the door without ceremony. "Kitchen's through there," he said. "Your room's at the top of the stairs. Wood's in the crate by the stove. I light the fire at 6, but if you're up before that, you light it yourself. All right? Supper's yours starting tomorrow. Tonight I'll manage." He didn't tell her what he liked to eat, or where anything was kept, or anything at all about the girl he'd mentioned in the letter. He went out through the kitchen, and the back door closed, not hard, just closed, final in a way that told her the conversation, such as it was, had ended. She stood in the front hall a long moment. Somebody had swept it recently. She could tell by the faint broom marks pressed into the corners, the small signature a person leaves without meaning to. The kitchen beyond it was cold in the particular way of a room that had once been warm and had simply gone quiet since. A stove, a shelf of tin plates stacked with more care than she expected. A window over the wash basin looking out onto a yard where one lone cottonwood had already dropped half its leaves. She carried her trunk up the stairs herself. The room at the top had a window facing west, and the light coming through it at that hour was low and honest, the kind of light that shows you exactly what's there and nothing more. A narrow bed. A chest with 2 drawers. A tin candle holder on the sill. The candle inside it burned down maybe an inch, not much, but enough to tell her the room hadn't always been empty. She set her trunk on the chest. She didn't unpack yet. She stood at the window instead and watched the mountains take the last of the light, turning from pale gold to something closer to bone. She came down before sunrise the next morning, and the fire was already lit. She could hear it from the stairs, the low tick of wood catching, and by the time she reached the kitchen, Ezra was already gone. A pot of coffee sat on the back burner, one cup on the counter. Not two, she found the pantry herself. Eggs, a cut of salt pork, cornmeal, dried beans in a sack that had been tied and retied so many times the string had gone gray. She took inventory the way you do when you're building a life out of somebody else's leftovers, and then she made a meal and didn't think much past it. Ezra came in when it was ready, as if he'd smelled it from the yard, though she'd made no noise to announce it. He sat. She set the plate down. She took the chair across from him and ate without looking up much. Morning light came in sharp through the east window, showing the grain of the table, a hairline cracked near the edge, a faint ring stamped in from some cup set down wet years ago. "Beans want soaking the night before," he said, not unkind. Just a fact offered the way he seemed to offer most things. "I'll remember that." He finished, put his plate in the basin himself, and went back out. She sat a while longer with her coffee, in a kitchen that felt quiet in the particular way of a room that had held a great deal of silence over a long stretch of years. Not empty, exactly. Just used to it. There was a mending basket by the door she'd walked past 3 times without truly seeing. A small shirt sat folded over the rim, one sleeve torn clean through, the kind of tear that comes from catching on something sudden. She picked it up, small shoulders. She thought of the girl mentioned in the letter and set the shirt back exactly as she'd found it. She would ask before she touched anything that wasn't hers to touch yet. That felt like the right way to begin. Outside, wind came down off the peaks, finding the gap between the house and the barn before it found her. A low sound the walls let in just enough to remind her the cold was still out there. Patient. Waiting its turn. "If you're new here, I'm Adelina, and this is the winter I spent keeping house on the edge of nowhere." For a man who barely spoke, and a little girl who was about to teach me more than I ever expected to learn from a 7-year-old. "It doesn't stay quiet for long. Stay with me." The wind found the doorframe before it found her, a rattle of the latch, then a settle. Late afternoon had gone dim the way afternoons do when nobody's thought to light a lamp yet. She hadn't lit one either. She stood at the window instead, watching the yard. The fence, the barn door left half open, the flat gray sky pressing down at the edges where the mountains cut into it. She had been in the house maybe 4 hours. She didn't know where Ezra was. She didn't know where the girl was. She knew where the broom lived now, and the flower, and the loose board by the pantry that caught under her heel if she came at it wrong. She had already learned to walk around it without thinking. She found the lamp oil on the second shelf, trimmed the wick with the small scissors hanging beside it, and lit it. The kitchen came back warmer, or seeming to be. The door opened at half past the hour. She knew it by the light more than any clock, pale to gray to that flat blue-gray that meant the day was nearly finished. Ezra came in first, the same unhurried economy in the way he moved, like most entrances didn't require preparation. He hung his hat, his coat, glanced at the lamp, then at her, and said nothing about either. The girl came in behind him, smaller than Adelina had pictured from the shirt, with dark hair and a stubborn set to her jaw that looked borrowed from her father. She looked at Adelina the way children look at anyone their parents have arranged into the house, directly, without the courtesy adults extend of pretending not to stare. Adelina held the look without flinching. The girl glanced at her father, then back, then at the stove, because the stove was interesting and safer than a stranger. Ezra washed his hands at the basin and dried them on the cloth Adelina had hung from the oven handle that morning. The cloth she had put there herself, and something about watching him reach for it. Like it had always belonged there settled, a small, unsettled thing in her chest. Supper was simple bread, what was left in the pot, a scrape of butter, salt from a chipped crockery dish. They ate with little talk. The girl asked once for more bread, and Adelina cut it before Ezra could answer, which made neither of them say anything, though the girl looked at her again over the slice. Different this time. Still measuring, but measuring against something now instead of nothing. Her name, Adelina learned over the next several days, was Rosalie. Everyone called her Ro. She was up before the light most mornings after that first one, not because anyone told her to, but because the kitchen had become the one room in the house that felt entirely hers for a few private minutes before the day claimed it back. She moved the coffee tin from the high shelf, where she had to reach past a hanging coat to get it, down to one at eye level. She didn't know if Ezra would mind. She moved it anyway. She was pouring the first cup when she heard Ro on the stairs. A lighter step than her father's, less certain. The kind that pauses on a tread to test whether the day is safe yet. She didn't turn around. She poured a small cup and set it at the end of the table where she'd seen the girl sit the night before. "It's hot," she said. "Careful." A silence, the fire ticking. The window going pale. "Papa drinks his without sugar," Ro said. "I don't." Adelina found the sugar tin on the same one-sun-reachable shelf and set it down with a small spoon. Ro looked at the tin, then the spoon, then at Adelina's back as she returned to the stove. She heard the girl help herself, careful, like she wasn't sure it was allowed. Ezra came down 20 minutes later. She knew the weight of him on the stairs now, deliberate, already awake before his boot hit the last step. He stopped in the doorway the way Ro had stopped the day before, though for a different reason. Ro had been checking whether Adelina was still there. Ezra was reading something in the room she couldn't name yet. His eyes went to the empty high shelf, then to the tin now sitting low, within reach. He said nothing about it. He poured his coffee and sat. He watched his daughter nursing her small cup with both hands wrapped around it, slow, careful, like she was rationing something precious. He didn't say anything about that either. He drank his coffee and looked out at the yard, where frost sat thin along the fence rail, catching the little light there was. That afternoon, alone in the house, Adelina found herself talking. Not to anyone, just quietly under her breath, the way you do when a language feels close to slipping if you don't use it. A few words of Italian while she folded linens. She didn't notice Ro in the doorway until the girl spoke. "What's that?" Adelina turned. "Just words." "From home. Say another one." She thought a moment, then offered a simple phrase, the word her own mother used to say at the end of the day, a kind of blessing folded into a farewell. Ro repeated it badly, all the vowels flattened. Adelina corrected her gently. Ro tried again, closer. She said it a third time, and this time it landed nearly right. And something in the girl's face lifted with the particular pride of a child who has just been handed something that belongs only to her. Neither of them made anything of it out loud. But Adelina noticed that for the rest of that day, Ro carried the phrase around with her, mouthing it to herself over the wash basin, over her slate at the kitchen table. The way children carry small treasures in the deep part of a pocket, checking now and then that it's still there. Supper that evening, Ro announced 2 words to her father, said carefully, watching his face to see if she'd gotten them right. Ezra looked at his daughter for a long moment, an expression on his face that Adelina didn't try too hard to read. He asked what they meant. Ro told him, proud of herself. He repeated one back, quiet, not for show, the way a man says something new just to feel how it sits in his mouth. Later, after Ro had gone up with less protest than usual, still murmuring the words to herself like a lamp held carefully in both hands, Ezra stayed at the table while Adelina worked at the basin. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It hadn't been, not for a while now. The particular quiet of 2 people who'd shared a space long enough that silence didn't require explaining itself anymore. "The hinge on the pantry door doesn't stick anymore," he said without preamble. "No," she said, not turning. "That's been wrong since before winter." She said nothing. She rinsed the last bowl. He didn't push it further, but she felt him differently in the room after that. The way you notice a fire once it shifts, and the heat reaches you from a slightly different angle than before. She dried her hands and turned. He wasn't looking at her, just at the table, thumb moving slowly along the rim of his cup. Nothing more than that. A man at the end of a long day. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said back, flat and plain, the way he said most things. She went up. Through the wall she could just make out Ro, still murmuring, still practicing, getting the vowels a little closer each time. A small clear jar appeared on the kitchen windowsill a few mornings later that hadn't been there the night before, dried sage inside. A sprig of something else she didn't recognize at first. She pulled the cork and breathed it in. Lavender, faded and old, the kind of scent kept folded in a linen drawer. The kind of thing a woman keeps. She set the jar back and asked nothing about it. Ezra was already in the yard, splitting wood in steady, even strokes, the sound carrying flat and clean across the cold. She watched him without meaning to, the economy of it, one motion folding into the next. Ro came down half asleep, hair every direction, and sat without a word until her bread was in front of her. Then out of nowhere, "You know songs in Italian." Adelina turned from the stove. "He told you that? Last night." "He said I could ask if I wanted to know some." She thought about the jar on the sill, the pantry hinge that no longer complained. "After supper," she said. "If you still want to, then." By now you're probably wondering how a season of housekeeping turns into something neither of them saw coming, and trust me, it does turn. In a way I didn't see myself until it was already happening. But first, there's a night on a porch step I need to tell you about. What happened that evening wasn't a lesson so much as a small gift passed hand to hand. While they cleared the table, Adelina said the same phrase again, her mother's good night, worn smooth from years of use. And Ro repeated it, closer now, and Adelina corrected the last vowel. And Ro said it again, and it was nearly right. Ezra came in from the porch partway through and stood in the doorway, one hand flat against the frame, and listened without a word. Adelina didn't look at him directly. She didn't stop either. The phrase passed between her and Ro 3 more times, softer each pass, the kitchen going very still around the small sound of it. When she finally glanced up, Ezra had already stepped back out into the dark, and through the window she could see the shape of him standing there. Still. Listening to something that wasn't quite meant for him, and choosing to hear it anyway. That night Adelina lay awake longer than usual. A warm wind had come up from the south, dry, carrying a smell she couldn't place, cut grass, maybe, or the dust of open country beyond the last fence post. She'd left her window cracked. She listened to it move the curtain and thought about the shape Ro's mouth made getting the vowel right, the small, proud lift of her chin. She thought about Ezra in the doorway, not filling the frame the way some men might, just still, his weight carried evenly, like he'd stopped moving and found no reason yet to start again. She turned onto her side. She had been careful, she reminded herself. She had kept herself useful and contained, present only in the ways the arrangement called for. She cooked. She mended. She kept Ro's shirts clean, and her letters improving day by day. She had learned in places before this one, on boats, and in boarding houses, and in the quiet after her mother died, to keep what was hers folded up small inside the walls of herself. So it never became a weight someone else had to carry. But the phrase she'd given Ro tonight hadn't stayed folded. It had come out of her before she'd made any decision about it at all, her mother's word, with that particular downward softness on the last syllable. The tone you use when you mean more than the word itself. Stay safe until morning. Mean something to someone when you wake. She hadn't meant to hand that away. She was still turning it over when she heard it, the creak of the porch step. The one that used to be loose and had been fixed. She knew the sound of every board in this house by now, and this wasn't the wind. This was weight, deliberate. Someone sitting down in the dark just below her window. She didn't move. She lay there and listened to him not moving either, the night settling around both of them, neither one making another sound. She wasn't afraid. That was the first thing she understood lying there. What she felt instead was quieter and stranger. The particular stillness of a woman realizing she'd been listening for a sound for weeks without knowing that's what she was doing. She counted what she could name, the curtain, a horse shifting down at the livery, a shutter somewhere down the road that had never been properly latched, and beneath all of it, steady, unmoving. His weight on the step. She didn't need to know what had brought him out there. There were nights a room got too small, and you needed the sky to remind you what size you actually were, and you sat with that until you could breathe right again. She'd done it herself more than once, in the weeks before she'd crossed an ocean for a stranger's kitchen. She thought about the ache sitting just under her sternum, not quite pain, the kind that means something you'd assumed was gone is actually still whole in you. She thought about the risk of a house like this one, not any improper risk, but the deeper kind. The risk of a routine starting to feel like it belonged to you. The risk of a child who says a phrase in your dead mother's language, like it's the most natural thing in the world. The risk of a man who leaves a cup on the counter without ceremony, the way you leave something for someone whose presence has simply become part of the shape of your morning. She pressed her palm flat to the mattress. Outside, he didn't move. She wondered if he was watching the same stripe of moonlight she'd been watching, or if his eyes were closed. Or if he was looking at nothing in particular the way, a man looks at nothing when he's actually thinking about something he doesn't have a name for yet. The shutter down the road complained once more and went quiet. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. Morning came without announcing itself, thin gray light. Then the rooster passed the livery. Then the particular groan of the iron hinge on the back gate that still needed tending. She heard his boots cross the porch, descend the 2 steps, and stop. She was dressed already, had been for the better part of an hour. She came down to a kitchen that still held yesterday's smoke, and underneath it, the cold mineral smell of an early autumn house that hadn't been warmed for the day yet. The coffee pot sat on the stove, unlit beneath it. She lit the fire herself. Her hands knew the motion well enough now that they didn't need her attention. And she was glad of that, glad to have something to do with her hands, while the rest of her settled back into its ordinary shape. Ezra came in when the coffee was ready. He stood in the doorway a moment, taking the room in, then crossed to the table and sat. She set his cup down. He wrapped both hands around it, looking toward the window where the light was just starting to separate the glass from the wall around it. She sat across from him with her own cup, and neither of them spoke, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It hadn't changed its shape from before, practical, undemanding. Whatever had passed between them in the dark hadn't broken the quiet. It had only settled deeper into the bottom of it. He turned his cup once on the table, set it down. She's got a birthday coming. Adelina looked up. 3 weeks out. She likes lemon cake when it can be managed. Adelina held her cup with both hands and thought about lemons, whether they could be had at the general store this late in the year. About the exact oven heat a cake like that would need. I can manage it, she said. He nodded and looked back at the window, and the light kept coming, showing the dust on the road, the uneven boards of the walk across the way. A flag over the assay office lifting in a small cold wind. 3 weeks doesn't sound like long, until you're the one waiting to find out what a lemon cake actually means in a house like this one. Stick around because the answer isn't what either of us expected. The 3 weeks pass the way late autumn does, not slow, not fast, but with a kind of gathering weight. Each day pressing the one before it a little deeper into the ground. Adelina found lemons at the general store on a Thursday. 2 of them, waxy and pale, tucked behind a crate of dried beans like they were being hidden on purpose. She carried them home like they were something precious, and set them on the kitchen sill where they sat for 4 days, the single most vivid thing in the room. The birthday landed on a Sunday. Adelina was up before the light, oven already climbing toward heat, when she heard small feet in the hall and turned to find Ro in the doorway in her nightgown, hair loose down her back. Wearing the careful expression of a child trying hard not to want something too much. Go put your socks on, Adelina said. It's cold, Ro went. She came back with her socks on and stayed in the doorway anyway, until finally she crossed the rest of the way in and sat at the table, and neither of them said much, and the oven did its slow work. Ezra came down later, when the cake was cooling on the counter. He stood in the doorway the same way his daughter had, looking at the cake, then at Adelina, then out the window, and said only, "You got lemons." "Thursday," she said. He nodded and said nothing else, but something had eased in his face that she hadn't seen loosen before. Ro ate 2 slices by noon and fell asleep on the settee with her mouth still faintly sweet. Ezra covered her with the quilt off the chair arm without waking her, and stood over her a long moment before he came back to the kitchen, where Adelina was washing the pan. He picked up the drying cloth without being asked. When she handed him the pan, he dried it and set it exactly where she'd been putting it for weeks now, like it had always lived there. They worked in silence until the kitchen was clean. She was hanging the cloth back on its rail when he said her name, her real name, not the formal address he'd used since she arrived, but the name her mother used to call her. She didn't know how he'd learned it. Someone in town, most likely, in the way small towns pass along everything they know without meaning to. She stilled, hand still on the cloth. She turned. He was leaning back against the counter, arms loose at his sides, looking at her the way a man looks at something he's already made up his mind about, has been making up his mind about, quietly. For longer than he'd let on. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not just through the season, not just for Ro's sake." Stay, outside, the wind moved down the empty road, and the flag over the assay office lifted once and settled, and the kitchen door stood open between them, letting the cold and the last of the light in together. She didn't answer right away. She thought about the letter, worn soft at its folds, still tucked in the bottom of her trunk upstairs. About 4,000 miles, and a season that was supposed to end come spring. About the phrase she'd given Ro without meaning to, and the porch step that creaked under a weight she'd learned to listen for without admitting it. About lemons kept on a windowsill for 4 days because some part of her had already been building toward this exact kitchen, this exact question, long before either of them had said it out loud. "All right," she said, just that. 2 words plain as anything he'd ever said to her, and somehow it was enough to change the shape of the whole house around them. He didn't smile, not exactly, but something in his shoulders came down that she hadn't realized had been held up so long. He nodded once, like a man closing a ledger he'd been keeping open far too long, and went to check on the fire, and she stood in the kitchen a moment longer, listening to Ro's soft breathing from the front room, to the wind finding its way along the fence line outside, to a house that had stopped somewhere in the last 3 weeks, being someone else's and started, quietly, without either of them announcing it, to become hers too. So that's the winter that turned into something neither of us was looking for. If you'd gotten that letter, if you'd been the one standing on that platform with a trunk and a strange man walking toward you, what would you have done? I'd love to know where you're watching this from tonight, wherever in the world that happens to be. If this one found its way into you, tell me in the comments, give it a like, and if you want more stories like this, stay close, there's plenty more where this came from.